Greetings. In this video, I'd like to cover the state of the pews, or more specifically, the current state of discussion about the pews at First African Baptist Church in Savannah, Georgia. In this video, I'll be focusing on the conversation that has developed over the course of the month of November, or more specifically, over the course of the last 2 weeks. As was covered in my last video, on November 17th, Benayah Israel shared a post on Facebook which covered his initial attempts to interpret the markings on one of the pews at that church. And as I've said before, while I did not agree with Benayah's conclusions, I really appreciated his effort, as he was the first proponent of the claim that Hebrew appears on the pews to actually participate in a public examination of the markings themselves, which is what I've always called for. Now, a little less than 3 hours after his first post went up, I shared my thoughts on what he had proposed, and a half a day later, I put up my previous video, which explored his post in a bit more detail. A little over 2 hours after that, Benayah put up a second post, which refined his interpretation of the markings on the relevant pew. And the next morning, I shared my thoughts on Benayah's second post, and I did so through a Facebook post of my own. That was November the 19th, and at that time some were encouraging me to go ahead and make a second video sharing my thoughts on Benayah's second post, just as I had made my first video on with regards to his first post. However, I had seen that Kelly Richardson had put up a YouTube community post declaring a quote-unquote checkmate and declaring that it has been confirmed that Hebrew was on the pews. So before making a second video on the subject, I wanted to wait to see if Kelly Richardson or others connected to him might release videos of their own settling on or endorsing specific strings of characters, because that would be the most central question of the debate. Of this disagreement, if you're going to say that Hebrew appears on the pews, you should lay out precisely what you think that Hebrew says. In the roughly week and a half that has transpired since, a number of different videos did come out, but I must confess, they left a bit to be desired, to put it mildly. Basically, they combine into 7 hours of discussion, which never get around to proposing a precise string of characters, a precise Hebrew phrase. And for me, that's unfortunate. Now, among those videos, the most significant was a panel discussion hosted on the Boom Church Atlanta account on November 22nd. And although it was over 2 hours long, the panelists never got around to sharing a precise Hebrew sentence, but they did nonetheless, they made a claim that they had found a coherent sentence, and while they didn't actually share that precise sentence, they offered an alleged translation of that sentence, and they even claimed that a scholar had backed it. So here, take a look at the relevant portion from that panel discussion, and this comes towards the end of the discussion, and note carefully how the host, Pastor Majors, shares the alleged translation, declares that the challenge to find a coherent Hebrew sentence has been met, and even claims that he has scholarly backing for that sentence.
So not only does it say take a grasp of God, but it said take a grasp of Yah or God Israel with a bass voice, as you put it, or with a loud voice, meaning praise him loudly. That's what this means. So Abu asked, can we find a coherent sentence? Well, yeah, we just did. And not only that, we got a scholar to back it.
Okay, the tone there was pretty triumphant, and some people found it very convincing. But the glaring lacuna for me was the fact that they didn't share the precise Hebrew sentence. Nonetheless, it's worth noting that while we cannot say that everyone on the panel endorsed Pastor Major's claim that day, Kelly Richardson clearly has embraced it. Now, he's opened at least 3 of his recent videos with that clip, followed by a clip of the boxer Zab Judah getting knocked out by Kostya Tszyu while a voice repeatedly yells, "It's over!" He also ended at least one video with that as well. So here, for example, see how he ended this particular show from November 26th.
All right, and appreciate everyone for tuning in, but here's the clip of Moray Majors and what he shared, and we're just going to wrap up with this. Here we go.
Not only did you bring out, but he also it showed there was some other aspects within the pews that we didn't know. And it says here, thanks for the new look. Thanks for the new look at the characters. Looking at it, that says, it seems to me that you could also see Yisrael in the characters or in the pews. So not only does it says take a grasp of God, but it says take a grasp of Yah or God Israel with a bass voice, as you put it, or with a loud voice, meaning praise him loudly. That's what this means. So Abu asked, can we find a coherent sentence? Well, yeah, we just did. And not only that, we got a scholar to back it. So we know what the actual language is. We know what's on the pews. We know what the specific pew says. We haven't broken down all of the pews, but we don't need to break down all of them. We got at least one pew that we can know that it is Hebrew on the pews.
It's over! It's over! It's over! It's over! It's over! It's over! It's over!
Back on November 22nd, after the panel discussion on the Boom Church Atlanta page, I was in the live chat of Kelly Richardson's show from later that evening, and I noted that I was waiting to see if a string of characters would be endorsed by the video. Now, another person in that live chat, writing under the name Second Exodus, and no doubt influenced by the Boom Church panel discussion, responded as follows, quote, turn the pews on the side and you can see it, end quote. Then he offered a translation, quote, take grasp of God, Israel, with praise, end quote. So I asked the natural question, what precise string of characters is that a translation of? Unfortunately, the person writing under the name Second Exodus never answered, nor could he have possibly ever answered, though not because of anything wrong with him being, not because there's anything wrong with him, but rather because the video which led him to believe that the sentence had been provided never actually provided that sentence. So just to be clear, I wasn't saying there's something wrong with him, but I'm saying it would be impossible for anyone to watch that video and pull up the relevant sentence which was allegedly being translated, because I'm going to argue that no such sentence exists, nor can it exist for the relevant pew. But let's go through this process. I figured, at the time, I figured I should ask the people over at the Boom Church Atlanta account to provide the Hebrew text that was allegedly behind the translation they offered. So I went over to their video from November 25th, which provides a 17-minute excerpt from their panel discussion that took place 3 days earlier. As this excerpt focused on the portion which gave the translation, I left a comment asking if they could provide, the precise string of Hebrew characters, the precise Hebrew phrase behind that translation. I received a reply from Kelly Richardson in which he declared that I owed him and his family an apology. And while he expressed how offended he was, he likewise never got around to sharing the Hebrew sentence which is allegedly behind the translation he had so enthusiastically embraced. So I respectfully commented that, I do not recall ever disrespecting Pastor Kelly Richardson, and I asked him to point out, the alleged disrespect which he had in mind. And then towards the end of my reply to him, I reiterated my request that they should share the relevant Hebrew sentence they've been boasting about. Kelly Richardson replied again, this time declaring, quote, I'm not going to share a single thing with you, end quote. And then, more angrily, seemingly, and as it's in all caps, he declared, you will get no assistance from me nor anyone in this group, end quote. Then another person, writing under the name Tazara, replied that, he likewise felt that, or hoped that they wouldn't give me anything, in response to my request to share the Hebrew sentence that they claim they found. So think about what's going on here. The host claimed to have met the challenge to find a coherent Hebrew sentence, and then he directed that declaration at me specifically.
Abu asked, can we find a coherent sentence? Well, yeah, we just did.
He even gave an alleged translation of that sentence.
Take a grasp of Yah or God Israel with a bass voice.
Yet when I asked for the precise sentence, people different people, including Kelly Richardson, were trying to tell me that I'm unworthy to receive it. Now, that's on par with boasting that they found a coherent sentence, but also treating the sentence as a secret. Or it's on par with telling specifically me that I need to accept that a coherent sentence has been found, while also telling me that I don't deserve to see the alleged sentence. As you might imagine, I found this rather curious. But that's okay. I'm pretty sure I know how Pastor Majors arrived at that translation. He based it largely on Benayah's aforementioned second post, and then used an email in which David Bunis had suggested that Israel might be seen in the markings, and he took that email as license to just insert the word Israel into the translation, wherever he thought it fit best. And, with all due respect to Pastor Majors, neither his approach nor the English translation he offered can be justified. Not by the markings in that pew, and we're going to attempt to show that now. So first, to understand this, we need to look at Benayah's second attempted transcription of what appears on the pew. Before we begin, however, I want to offer a disclaimer I've offered before, that while I will be disagreeing with Benayah's second post, this is not so much intended as a critique of him, of Benayah. Rather, the point is to note the problems with Pastor Major's hasty declaration, as well as with those who were convinced by it. As I'll touch on at the end of the video, I do not include Benayah amongst those who endorsed Pastor Major's hasty and unjustified boast or declaration. With that, let's look at Benayah's second post. So, in this top line, he's proposing that the string of characters are kof, het, which he treats as a verb meaning to take or grasp. Now, I realize that those familiar with Hebrew might immediately wonder, wait, what verb is that? And we'll get to that in a moment. But for now, I just want to be clear on the strings of characters being proposed in Benayah's second transcription. And again, he was proposing that these characters were in the Solitreo script. Oh, and by the way, that kof, het, all of these Hebrew characters, Benayah was proposing that they are written on the pew from left to right, not the way Hebrew's typically written, which is right to left. He's proposing they move from left to right. So that's kof, het, moving from left to right. Then, in this second line, he proposed that wa yod yod appeared, which he treated as a reference to God. And again, remember that he's arguing that the text is written from left to right. In the third line, he's proposing a prefixed bet, as a preposition appears. And then in the fourth line, he proposed that beit het was the string of characters, which he argued means praise. And perhaps as a vestige from his first post, at the bottom of his second post, of the screenshot in his second post, he offers, quote, take or grasp God with a bass voice, end quote, as the possible translation. Now, I say that's a vestige of his first post because in that post, in his first post, he had interpreted the last two characters as beit shin, and when he was using the translation site, he accidentally hit the samek key instead of the shin key and the translation application he used treated that as the modern Israeli Hebrew word bas, which is a loan word from the English word bass, like in the sense of a bass guitar or having bass in one's voice, which is how he wound up with the translation bass voice, which is no longer possible if the last two characters are beit het. Whatever the case, with that, now we can look at the relevant pew, and we're looking at it rotated 90 degrees to the left. This portion here is what is interpreted as reading kof, het, het. This portion here is what's interpreted as reading wa, yod, yod. And this portion here is what is interpreted as reading beit, beit, het. Now, I realize that some will find it awkward to look at the transcription from left to right, so just for ease of reference, I'm going to put the same string of characters at the top of the screen from right to left. It's just so people can get a sense of what's being proposed here. Now, there's a lot to say here. First, now that Kelly Richardson has endorsed this reading, I want to state more forcefully something which I alluded to in my first video. Before Benayah got involved in this discussion, none of the proponents of the view that Hebrew appears on the pews were willing to publicly examine the markings themselves. So, and Kelly Richardson in particular would make videos on the subject of the pews, but he would focus on all sorts of things other than the markings. And one of his arguments in that regard insisted on the significance of the stained glass windows in the sanctuary being organized from right to left.
Here, I'm gonna step back so you can see a bigger picture of the sanctuary, right? You can see it behind me, right? I want y'all to pay attention to that. The pictures are listed just like ancient Hebrew, reads from right to left. So the first pastor, which is his name is Reverend Andrew Bryan, 1812. Oh, you see how it is? It goes from right to left, right to left.
Notice how they completely left out me explaining the arrangements of each pastor on the stained glass picture that's arranged according to how the Hebrew language is read from right to left.
Supposedly that was meant to tell us something about the markings on the pews. However, now that he's endorsed an interpretation which treats the text as moving from left to right, one is left to wonder what was the point of insisting on even the windows going from right to left if now his position is that the actual markings themselves on the pews don't necessarily have to move right to left. When you look at it against the backdrop of the history of this discussion, that juxtaposition looks somewhat awkward. But I digress. Getting back to Benayah's transcription, I want to focus on the line being interpreted as a qaf. Note that in the Solitreo script, the qaf is basically a vertical line, often with a small loop at the top. But this line here is practically horizontal relative to the position of the other supposed characters. And that's significant because if it's being tacitly proposed that a character can be turned on its side, one is left to wonder how one knows if, for example, the markings interpreted as chets aren't actually just kafs turned on their side. For me, this seems to intensify the arbitrary feel this could have. But that aside, getting back to the transcription of the markings, looking at them now, I'm sorry, but I'm going to say flat out that is not a coherent sentence. I don't mean that disrespectfully towards Benayah, but I'm nonetheless going to say that with all due respect, that this is not a coherent sentence, and I'll attempt to explain why in a moment. Before doing so, however, I also want to note that this sentence, this string of characters in the transcription, does not justify the translation given by Pastor Majors.
Take a grasp of Yah or God Israel with a bass voice.
Even if, for the sake of argument, one accepted this transcription, it's impossible to fit the word Israel into these markings as well. Try it yourself. Where exactly does Israel appear in those markings? Now, I know some will want to say a scholar said it goes in there, but I'm sorry. He never told you to slip it in amongst this string of characters, and we're going to get to that too. Putting the word Israel aside, however, for now, I want to discuss how Benayah arrived at the translation he put forth. Whether it's take grasp of Yah is with a bass voice, or more properly in light of the Beit Ched at the end and the way he translated that, take grasp of Yah with praise or something like that. Now, before doing so, I want to show a clip of Pastor Kelly Richardson on that Boom Church panel mentioning that he saw my critiques of Benayah's first post, and I guess tacitly his second post as well. Now, note in particular where Pastor Richardson claims that I had said not to trust the translation site that they've leaned on to translate these strings of characters, because that's going to be relevant to this discussion.
And Abu is he's literally going and critiquing Benayah Israel's findings. And he literally talks about this, he mentions it right in his video. Because I saw it last night. I downloaded the video. He literally was going through saying how Benayah, don't trust that site that he went through, the mistakes that he said he believed he made, and how come he's using two chets,
I saw that video.
So this is the site they were using to attempt to translate the strings of characters they were coming up with. Now, it is a gross oversimplification to claim that I just said don't trust the site. What I've actually argued, and will continue to argue here, is that if one is going to try to employ this site to decipher the markings, to decipher strings of Hebrew characters, they need to understand how that website works, how the application or program works. The main thing to keep in mind is that it's a mistake to think that just because the site suggests a translation for a string of characters, that must mean the string of characters is therefore coherent Hebrew. That's a mistake. The reality is that even if you enter an incoherent string of Hebrew characters, the site is likely to give you something back. The reason why is because in the case of incoherent strings of characters, the program attempts to offer something with a relatively close spelling. It basically arrives at a guess by sometimes ignoring characters that might be superfluous, or removing initial letters that might be prefixes, or speculating as to characters which might have accidentally been left out. And it makes these sort of guesses within a fraction of a second. But by the way, there is a way to tell. There is a way to sort of know if what you entered is probably gibberish, if it's being treated as gibberish, if it's being treated as incoherent by the translation site that we're looking at. So to start, I'm going to give a few examples. And the first example I'll give is I'll enter Nun Chet, which is how you spell the name Noah. Now notice all the information I get back. It gives me a Bing translation, a reverso.net translation, a Morphix definition, and an entry from milon.co.il. But now let's scroll back up and put in, something similarly spelled, but yet still gibberish. In this case, I'm going to put an extra chet at the end. That's not a coherent Hebrew word, yet when we attempt to translate that, we again get Noah. But that's not how Noah is spelled. More importantly, however, notice how all that other extra information from Morphix and Reverso and Bing is gone. No recourse to Bing or Morphix or any other source. It's just a single guess in favor of something similarly spelled in a vacuum. After the guess, the rest of the page is empty. And this is important to note because when the site gives you back a single translation in a vacuum without recourse to various other sources, that's a sign that you probably entered some gibberish. And the sole answer given back is merely an attempt to grasp for something in proximity to the string you entered. Let's look at a couple more examples to drive this point home, and then we'll get to the string of characters which Benayah actually proposed and Pastor Majors tacitly adopted. Here I'll enter lamed kof kof, which is the root for a verb meaning to lick. And you see I get a more complex set of results back, including a partial conjugation chart for the relevant verb. But suppose I then add a third kof to the string. This word now is not coherent Hebrew. This is frankly gibberish. Yet the site gives me back a single answer, lick. And it gives that to me in a vacuum. The rest of the answer section is empty. Again, a sign that what I entered is gibberish. Okay, bear with me, one final example, and then I'm going to get to the actual string of characters proposed by Benayah and them. Here I'm going to enter Yod Chet Yod He, Yichye, Yichye, which is a third-person masculine singular imperfect tense rendering of the verb lichyot. It means he or it, and masculine it, he or it will live. And as it's coherent Hebrew, you see I get back a complex answer with entries from Bing and the Reverso and Morphix, etc. But now let me go back up there and just for the fun of it, throw a mem at the end, making it incoherent. Sure enough, I get the single guess in a vacuum, will live, without anything after that. But let's get really crazy. I'm going to enter in Yod Chet Lamed Yod Yod Wa Chet Chet. This is absolute nonsense. It's meaningless. It's just pure gibberish. Yet the program is going to try to make sense of it by ignoring several characters, and then it's going to try to speculate as to the accidental absence of another. What answer does it give back? Yet again, will live. But a single answer in a vacuum, which again is a sign that the entry was actually incoherent, despite the fact that they gave something back for it. With those examples, let's now start entering the strings of characters Benayah proposed. Remember that he arrived at his proposed translation by employing this site. So first, we enter kof chet chet, and yes, we get back the word take. But note that it's another one of these sort of single answers with the rest of the page empty. And, here's the challenge. See if you can find kof het het, that root, in a Hebrew dictionary. The reality is that the site, first off, that's not a verbal root that I'm familiar with, and it's not one I can find in any dictionary. And therefore, unsurprisingly, the site was guessing as to what might have been meant, and it settled on kach, which is spelled coherent with a single het, which is the imperative form of the verb lakachat, which can mean to take. So the imperative form is just coherent. And when you enter that, you get a more complex range of answers, unsurprisingly. Now, let's run the wa yod yod string of characters through the program. And yes, you get back God or the Lord as one of the answers. And the reason why is because the double yod is used in some rabbinic corpora in reference to the tetragrammaton. But notice how in the entry that's given, the double yod stands alone without a wa preceding it. The program is able to arrive at this entry by guessing that the wa that is in the string of characters we entered was merely a prefix conjugation. That's important because it begs the question, what is that wa in Benayah's transcription? Why is there a wa between the alleged verb and its alleged object? And that could work if there were two objects to the verb and the conjugation was prefixed to the second one. But here it's incoherent. Now, finally, let's enter bet bet chet. Yes, the site offers the guess in praise, but notice again how that is just a single answer in a vacuum with the rest of the page empty. The reason why is because here the guess was that a shin was accidentally omitted. When you insert the shin between the two bets, it is then that you get a more complex set of answers, which really do mean, in praise of. And that's why I said that this is not a coherent sentence. The first and third strings are not recognizable Hebrew, and the middle string, if we try to treat it as an allusion to the tetragrammaton, that middle string has a badly out of place wa prefix to it, and it really confuses things if we try to treat that first string as a verb and the second as its object. So the wa is problematic as well. The first and third words are incoherent, and the middle word is, potentially coherent, but with a wa that doesn't make any sense. Now, at this point, more than a few folks might want to ask, didn't a prominent scholar confirm Pastor Major's translation? And Pastor Major certainly seemed to imply that was the case.
Can we find a coherent sentence? Well, yeah, we just did. And not only that, we got a scholar to back it.
But that begs a question. What exactly did the relevant scholar actually say? When one looks past the triumphant boasting, one realizes that they only showed a single email from Professor David Bonis, and he does not clearly confirm any sentence remotely close to the one pushed by Pastor Majors. This is all he stated. This is all that Professor Bonis stated. Thanks for this new look at the characters. Looking at it that way, I know it reads say, but I think it's pretty clear that he meant way. Looking at it that way, it seems to me that you could also see Israel, end quote. And that's it. There's nothing in there justifying the sentence Pastor Majors put forth. And, I'm guessing Pastor Majors hinged that leap on the word also in the email. Probably interpreting it to tacitly mean everything Benayah proposed is correct. Now just add the word Israel into the mix wherever you please. But of course, this email does not justify that sort of conclusion. If Pastor Majors has other emails that could shed more light on this, then, he's invited to share them. But as it stands now, that email does not support the sentence he proposed. So at this point, one might want to object that, Professor Bonis at least endorsed the word Israel in the pew, so it has to be Hebrew on the pew. Even here, I would say that depends on the extent to which he meant seems and could, quote unquote seems, quote unquote could. Because remember, he said that it seems like, you could read it this way. It's one thing if he meant that he took a quick look at the image they highlighted for him, and then he said it seems one could see Israel therein in the sense of there being a vague resemblance. But it would be something entirely different if he meant that he took a long, hard look and concluded that definitely it reads Israel. Those are two very different things. And, Pastor Majors apparently wants to assume the latter. He wants to assume that Professor Bonis meant that, he, as a scholar, he looked at it very closely and he pored over it and he's concluded definitively that it says Israel. I would ask this question. Where precisely does Israel appear in that pew? And the reason why this question is relevant is because if none of us can find it, that should be grounds to think that Professor Bonis meant what he wrote in a softer sense, sharing a lighthearted suggestion after a quick glance at a collection of markings which are open to multiple interpretations. And to drive this point further, consider this question. What precisely was the professor looking at? What was this quote-unquote new look that he had received? Now, we don't know for certain, but I suspect that it refers to the pew flipped 180 degrees from the way we were examining it. In short, I think the new look referred to the pew turned 90 degrees to its right rather than its left. As Pastor Majors said, he sent that as well, with relevant portions already highlighted. Here, take a look at this.
Go to the next slide. So I sent him, this is a part of the package again, and this is Benayah's part that I sent him as well.
So that, that text there, that angle with the markings already highlighted, that might cause the mind to vaguely associate this with the word Israel. And you might be wondering, how exactly does it do that? Well, note that this portion on the right, which sort of resembles a W, looks like a Hebrew sin. Admittedly, it's an Ashuri sin rather than a Solitreo sin, but a sin nonetheless. So too, the markings on the left resemble a Lamed, again, an Ashuri Lamed rather than a Solitreo Lamed, but still. And, once the mind sees that from a quick glance, it might associate it with, the word Israel. If one were to try to defend that interpretation, however, they might have to insist that, for example, the Yod was written by, a shaky hand which veered off dramatically, and the Resh might be thought of as a sort of like a Solitreo Resh, though minus the little loop which appears in some forms, and then maybe a Solitreo Aleph. Now, I don't know for certain if this is what Professor Bonis saw, but if he did, it would be interesting that what Benayah interpreted as two chets is here instead interpreted as a sin, and what was interpreted as Beit Chet is instead here interpreted as a Lamed. That would be significant because it would speak to how these markings are so vague as to be open to multiple interpretations. And to drive that point home, if we're going to say that it sort of looks like Israel, which I can agree with, in a very sloppily written form of Israel, I propose that we might alternatively see the Arabic word Rasul, like Muslims will refer to different prophets as an individual prophet as the Rasulullah, especially the man they consider to be the final prophet, right? Messenger of God. So Rasul, which again means messenger. And however, note that in this transcription, I rendered the loop in the wa in gray to signify that it's missing in the marking that it's being associated with. So maybe an even closer suggestion would be the Arabic word rasa'il, which means messages. And here I'll color code the corresponding letters and markings to make it a bit more clear. Now, just like with my video on Arabic in the pews from last year, I'm not seriously suggesting that Arabic appears in these markings. Rather, I'm offering a thought experiment. In my video from a year ago, I was trying to make a point about proper methodology, while meanwhile here, I'm attempting to illustrate the sort of polysemous nature of these vague markings. They can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. You can sort of vaguely see one thing, and you can sort of vaguely see something different. Although honestly, I feel like from this angle, the Arabic word rasa'il, meaning messages, in the Arabic script seems clearer than, for example, Israel in the Hebrew script, or some form of Hebrew script. At this point, now I probably should begin wrapping up this video. So to sum up what was covered so far, while some were convinced by Pastor Major's declaration that they found a coherent sentence in the relevant pew, it needs to be noted that Pastor Majors never shared that sentence. He gave an alleged translation of the sentence, but when one looks at the markings on the relevant pew, it's easy to come to the conclusion that it's impossible to produce a coherent Hebrew sentence which can translate along the lines that Pastor Majors proposed. And, I would propose that that's why no Hebrew sentence was ever shared alongside the alleged translation, because no such sentences exist. It's impossible to get, a Hebrew sentence like that translation out of this particular pew. And with that in mind, Kelly Richardson triumphantly embracing Pastor Major's hasty assertion that, especially seeing how the assertion lacks justification, I'm left to wonder how much thought did Pastor Kelly Richardson put into the claim before he so enthusiastically endorsed it. And I know he feels that I insult him, so again, I'm not trying to insult him, but I am being very serious here. Pastor Kelly Richardson clearly endorsed Pastor Major's assertion, and as the assertion lacks justification, we are within our rights to ask how much thought Kelly Richardson put into his endorsement. The endorsement likewise strikes me as rather hasty. But that said, earlier in this video, I was careful to note that we can't say everyone on that panel endorsed Pastor Major's declaration. Benayah in particular has been much more careful with how he's described the situation thus far. On November 27th, I appeared on Brother Berean's show and briefly laid out my concern that I've mentioned here, that it was claimed a coherent sentence was found and a translation was offered, but the sentence itself was never shared. And when I asked for the precise Hebrew sentence, some were bizarrely, trying to tell me or trying to insinuate that I'm unworthy somehow to receive it. It turns out that Benayah was also on Brother Berean's show that evening, and he offered a very measured reply, stating that one is within their rights to ask to see the sentence, but also asking that, that others be patient, as he and his team are apparently still working on deciphering the markings and running their interpretations by scholars. So here, listen to my brief exchange with Benayah on Brother Berean's show, and note the prudence and maturity of Benayah's reply. Here you go.
So the gist of it is, they say they gave the translation of the sentence that they found. They declare, there was a challenge to find a coherent Hebrew sentence on the Pews, and they're saying specifically on the pew that Benayah publicly looked at, they've found the sentence, they gave the translation, and they say a scholar backs it. My objection is, number one, they never show the precise string of characters, the precise Hebrew sentence that they're allegedly translating. And second, the scholar, the one email they showed, maybe they have other emails where he does endorse it, but the one email they showed was inconclusive. He's not clearly endorsing their translation, this long sentence that they gave. And then to make matters worse, I felt that was a relevant issue, so I left a comment on their video, and I said, could I have the precise string of characters? And at least two different people in the comment section of that video basically told me that I'm not worthy to receive it, that they shouldn't give it to me, almost as if it's a secret. So the challenge has been met, but to find this coherent Hebrew sentence, but, I can't, they haven't shown it yet, and there's people insinuating that they won't show it to me or that they shouldn't show it to me.
But yeah, but you do bring up a valid point as far as getting access to the information. So I do believe that at some point we'll present all of that out to the public. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it's just like it's in flight right now. It's being I can't really speak for Pastor Majors, other than it's going through its processes. Now, what I normally do is, and I've done this with, I've worked with, with people like in Portugal. What I normally like to do is we'll get documents that are written in a different language. So what I would normally do is just go through and just see if there's anything interesting in there. And if I found something interesting, I would throw it over the fence to a professor and say, hey, what do you think about this? Does this have the information that I'm looking for? And he or she would say yes. And then after that, we would go through, the secondary process, which is I would have a couple of people do some translations on it, but I would also send it off to a professional translation company that I would have to pay money out of my pocket. And, it can be pretty expensive. So sometimes I have to save up to be able to ship that off to get it translated, and it takes time to get it back. So I had planned on doing that with the whole Pew stuff. Basically when I released the video, it was step one. Step one, take a look at it, and just have the cursive Hebrew on one side and have the Pews on the other side. And so, like I said, I take that, and I actually started reaching out to my contacts overseas, because I'm getting ready to try to get this process. And then that's when I kind of linked up with, I hear from Pastor Majors and Pastor Kelly that they're also doing the same work. So we started combining forces on that. So, but yeah, it's in flight. I think you, like I said, I think you do have a valid point as far as getting access to the information. I'll just say be patient. I think there's they kind of wanted to vet it out a little bit more, because I think we're soliciting more than a couple professors, so that we can get this thing, have a full backing, you know.
Now, as I've said previously, while I disagree with Benayah's conclusions regarding the markings on the pews, I greatly respect and appreciate his efforts. Disagreement is not disrespect. Adding to that, I can respect his position that the process is ongoing and therefore one should be patient while, him and his team continue to explore these markings. And, I can definitely respect that and would say that everyone should take all the time they need. Beyond that, from my brief exchange with Benayah on Brother Berean's show, he struck me as a gentleman and a class act all the way. Finally, I want to address the claim made by some that if one is not an expert on this subject, if one is not a scholar with prestigious credentials, then they cannot comment on the topic at all. I would propose that it's a mistake to act as though the only categories here are elite scholar or witless crayfish. I'm not any sort of expert, but I am a student of language, and thus I'm able to at least raise meaningful questions, meaningful objections, and meaningful suggestions. And interestingly, in the Boom Church panel discussion, Benayah briefly commented that my criticisms revealed my ability to work my way around the markings. Now, I realized that there was an implication that I might be trying to hide certain things, but if we put that aside, I'd say his comments still reveals his sense that I'm not completely ignorant of the subject, so I want to share it.
When we put this initial translation out there, some of the critiques was, Benayah, he didn't pay attention to this marking right here. That's part of it. And I'm saying, so he knows that's part of it. He can read it.
Right.
Just stuff like that, or if you're saying like, these markings are in the opposite direction. How do you know they're in the opposite direction? He can read it.
Now, some of the objections that I've been seeing online, not necessarily from the panel, but from fans of the gentlemen who were on the panel, what I've been seeing online basically amounts to certain people confusing an academic discussion with like a religious cult. The interaction between a scholar and a student is not like the relationship between, a high priest and an acolyte, right? A suggestion from a professor is not a dogma that can never be questioned, I seriously doubt that Professor Bounice himself would ever declare that, something like the expert has spoken and thus no student of language can ever question it, nor can they ask for evidence, nor can they examine the matter for themselves, It's ridiculous. No scholar, no person in academia would say that once the expert speaks, the students can never question it, can never examine it for themselves. That's not how academia works.
That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works.
A few people online are trying to declare that, the expert has spoken, so the matter is closed. But, really, that's an attempt to avoid any further discussion regarding the markings themselves. Moreover, as I alluded to previously, they're not really saying just trust the scholar. What they really mean is simply accept our interpretation of what the scholar said and accept that interpretation on faith. On that note, I look forward to the comments of others, and I look forward to the discussion on the pews continuing to develop. God bless.